Is that okay? As long as I don't roam.
Yeah, don't roam too much.
This is our live stream.
This is our live stream. We've just gone live.
Well, good morning. Can I welcome you and welcome many of you back to the fund. I am going to start now and promptly because we need to finish very promptly at 9:30 this morning too. So thank you for arriving on time for our breakfast seminar on the budget and will it be a crunch year for the NHS and I guess social care and indeed public health as well. The first seminar in this series we held about a month ago, and it was about the implications of a minority government for the future of health and social care. We thought now was the right time post the budget to look more at the funding and explore this emerging debate about what can the NHS do and deliver with the additional funds delivered in the budget, but recognising the continuing constraints on both the NHS and on social care. We are live streaming today's seminar on YouTube, hence the technology at the front of the room. We do encourage you, if you're on Twitter, to share what you're hearing and what you're learning with colleagues who aren't able to be with us in the room today. But equally, please put your phones on silent so they don't disturb our speakers or indeed other colleagues in the room. You can see we've got 3 contributors, the usual format for all of these seminars, short, punchy presentations. We're going to start with my colleague, excuse me, Siva Anandaciva, who joined us about a year or so ago now, I think, Siva, from NHS Providers. He's our chief analyst here at the fund. I've done a lot of our work around preparation for the budget and the work we did with the Health Foundation and the Nuffield Trust, and then after the budget trying to make sense of what do the numbers mean and how good is the news coming out of the budget for the NHS and social care. So Siva will kick off. Will be followed then by Claire Fuller, who I'm going to describe as a recovering commissioner, practicing GP, and the senior responsible officer for the Surrey Heartlands. I'm told it's a delegated, devolved care system, not an accountable care system. That was a new one on me when Claire introduced me to that term a week or so ago, so you heard it here first at our breakfast seminar. I think it's a different version of an accountable care system in the sort of similar category as Greater Manchester, aspiring to do similar things, but as part of the devolution thrust. So Claire, we're looking forward to your perspective, wearing those multiple hats, following on from Siva. And then last but certainly not least, Jim Mackey, now returned to Northumbria Foundation Trust after a couple of years heading up NHS improvement. And Jim, we're grateful to you for finding the time, now you're back up there, a long way away from where you were, to join us to offer your perspectives, bringing obviously a provider point of view on the issues. We'll have about half an hour to engage with you for questions and for discussion, and as I say, we'll finish promptly at 9:30. So thank you again for joining us. Siva, the floor's yours.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Am I mic'd up sufficiently if I stand here? Yeah, good. So I just want to make about 4 or 5 points about what the budget said and what its implications are for health and social care, to provide some background for the discussions that Jim and Claire are going to lead later. And as Chris said, a lot of the work I'm going to be talking about was joint work between us and Nuffield Trust and Health Foundation. So the headlines for the budget will be familiar to many of you. 2.8 billion of extra funding for revenue budgets in the NHS over this Parliament. And revenue budgets for day-to-day spending, staff salaries, consumables, medicines, things like that. On top of that, an extra 3.5 billion of cash funding for capital investment, planned longer-term investment in buildings, facilities, equipment. And should a pay award be made for Agenda for Change staff in the NHS, then funding for that pay award will be on top of all of this if it's above the current public sector cap of 1%. So it's these three topics of revenue funding, capital funding, and the pay award that I'll talk about in just a little bit more detail in the next few slides. Let's start by looking at overall health expenditure. So this is the total Department of Health budget for England, adjusted for inflation and projected forward to the end of this Parliament. And it probably feels that every year in the NHS is a crunch year at the moment, but next year, 2018-19, was shaping up to be crunchier than most. And that's because even though the Department of Health's budget is continuing to rise, the rise of 0.5% planned next year would have been the lowest this Parliament. Spending per head would have actually fallen by 0.2%. So the government acted, and in the autumn budget provided extra funding, and this is what the total Department of Health budget now looks like, this orange line here. And I'll say a little bit more about some of the headlines. So an extra £337 million of funding to support the NHS this winter, so this year. If you wait long enough, everything comes back into fashion. We're getting SHAs again, we're getting winter funding again. And the real questions to be asked, as we used to ask, over what performance improvement can you realistically expect for this level of funding given this late in the year? And perhaps we'll come back to that in the discussions. Next year, 2018-19, £1.6 billion of funding, mainly allocated to support hospital waiting times, consultant-led treatment, A&E. Very little, if anything, of this growth is for mental health, out-of-hospital care, all of which have as much, if not more, calls on available funding. But you can see the problem the government was trying to address. If you look at spending per head, health spending per head of population in England, the black line at the bottom is what was planned before the budget, the orange line is after the budget. And you can see that now, rather than spending per head falling by 0.2% next year, it grows by 0.7%. You've pushed out the problem by a year. You've given yourself a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of headspace, but you've pushed out the problem rather than necessarily addressing it. And just to complete the story on the total budget, in revenue terms, an extra 900 million in 1920, and nothing for the outer 3 years of the Parliament. So no additional revenue funding. But that's because we'll have a spending review. Sorry, I realise I'm doing expressly what I was told not to in roaming, so I'm trying to stay here. Nothing for the outer years of the Parliament, but that's because we've got a spending review that will reopen the budget and give the government an opportunity to meet its pledge to spend £8 billion more in 2022-23 compared to 17-18. At the moment, you're talking about £6 billion, not the £8 billion that was pledged, but you have a spending review to correct that. So you may be wondering why I've stuck all my lines at the bottom where you can barely see any of the fluctuation. And the reason is I had to give myself room for the lines that show what we need to spend to keep pace with rising demand. So whether you use historical growth rates in the NHS budget, or whether you use our estimates based on OBR projections of rising demands due to a growing aging population medical advance, you're looking at 4 to 4.3% a year average annual growth in real terms. Even after the extra funding from the budget, you're looking at 1%, not 4%, 1% average annual growth in the Department of Health budget over this Parliament. So tough choices remain on the table. And as a result, the funding gap for next year has been less than half filled. We're still left with a £20 billion funding gap, at least, by the end of this Parliament. So let's move quickly on to capital spending. Capital spending, planned investment in facilities, buildings and equipment, as I said. Sir Robert Naylor's review helpfully put a figure on how much is needed, £10 billion, £5 billion of which is for investment in new models of care, transforming how services are delivered, investing in the 5-year forward view in STPs, £5 billion of which is to address the backlog of maintenance issues that have built up over the last few years due to historic underinvestment in capital. We've got, one chief exec was saying she's got radiographers now who are younger than some of the equipment that they're using. That's the scale of the issue. And if you look just at this high risk, that red sort of maroony colour, nearly £1 billion would be needed just to eradicate high-risk backup maintenance. That's where the building is already in disrepair, where the equipment has already failed and is not reliable. So this is serious stuff that needs investment. And again, the government acted. So over this Parliament, to provide the 10 billion funding that's required, 3.5 billion from the public funding from the Treasury has been provided on top of the 425 million that was provided earlier in spring. So that's the government's share towards this £10 billion capital need. The rest is assumed to come from asset disposals, so let's sell some of the surplus land in the NHS, and the remainder of the 10 billion will come from value for money private finance, things like PFI and PF2. So some real questions to ask about whether we'll see all this money over the Parliament. Firstly, can you get a value for money disposal of an asset over this Parliament? We've got some pretty bad history, some bad form when it comes to PF2, again in terms of value for money. So these are short timeframes to get this much funding into the system. We also have a long history of using capital budgets to support day-to-day running costs. So even if we can raise the money, can we be given assurance that all of it will be going towards capital projects? And finally, the question about distribution. So even if we pull off the asset disposals, a lot of that surplus land is in London. So what's the strategy for other parts of the country who also have capital requirements? So let me start to finish by looking at the pay award. So the Chancellor said in his speech that should a new pay deal be agreed with Agenda for Change staff, so these aren't doctors, these are staff like nurses, midwives, paramedics, on Agenda for Change contracts, and should that require a pay uplift over the 1% public sector pay cap, that will be fully funded above the levels I've already said the Department of Health budget will grow by. And before the budget, there was a lot of commentary and a lot of narrative that somehow this pay award would be linked to productivity. That's an unhelpful word to use in this context because it's not productivity in the sense of what workers are producing. What the pay award will be linked to is reform of the terms and conditions of the Agenda for Change contract, things like annual leave, out-of-hours payments, and progression through increments. So final slide, is the glass half full or half empty? It may not have come through, but I'm an optimist. So I genuinely think the glass is half full. This was a far better deal than I was expecting in terms of that might be a political party, or I think that might be real.
It could be the toaster.
I think that's it.
I think we ought to exit the building. Sorry. Just as you were getting to the punchline.
No.
Do you want to take your papers?
Well, I was going to say, you know what? Somebody says this is good news for the NHS, and this is what happened. Great live broadcast.
it disconnected. It's back now though.
So people have seen us evacuating.
Steve Powers, stuff going on there.
Give me time for your punchline.
I'll keep it very short.
It's always the talk. We'll finish at 9:30.
So what's that toast?
We're all toast. Okay, so thank you very much for evacuating speedily and safely. We ended up a couple of weeks ago being one of the centres that people sought refuge in when the incident happened at Oxford Circus. I wasn't here on the day, but I'm told by my colleagues that there were several hundred people who came and sought refuge for a couple of hours, and fortunately today was nothing like that. And we're all safe and sound. And we're waiting for the punchline now.
Well, I've changed my view now. The glass is half empty. But I'll keep it brief so I don't cut into other people's time. The one point I'd make is, the glass is almost full. It was better than was expected. And other government departments were, if I was working in another government department or local government or the prison service, I would look at what settlement the NHS got and I'd be green with envy and angry as well. So the extra funding is welcome. But at the same time, the extra funding, while better than expected, is not close to being enough to close a funding gap. So tough choices remain on the table as NHS England's board paper and board discussions reflected. On the capital funding, it would be deep red on my risk register on whether we'll actually see all this capital funding over the Parliament. And if you're a doctor or a dentist expecting a pay award, that will have to come from within the existing budget. But to finish, 2 points. Number one, nothing substantive on social care, public health, mental health, out-of-hospital care. You could read this budget and think that all that mattered were hospital waiting times, and obviously it's more complex than that. And my final point is not really connected to anything I've said, because I've talked about money almost exclusively. Nursing numbers continue to trend downwards. GP numbers continue to trend downwards. Not adjusted for demand, not adjusted for head. Actual numbers are trending downwards. So the most important document published this winter may not be the autumn budget for the NHS, it'll be the workforce plan. Because all this extra funding won't be much use if we don't have the staff to spend on. So sorry to end on a depressing note, and I'll hand over to
Siva, thank you. Claire, would you like to follow
Certainly.
on, please? And you are being filmed on the iPad over there.
Am I right standing here? Good, that's marvellous. Good morning, everybody. I'm Claire Fuller, I'm a GP in Surrey, and I've now moved from being the clinical chair at Surrey Downs to being the senior responsible officer for Surrey Heartland's devolved care system, so STP. I quite like the phrase recovering commissioner, which I think I'm going to adopt, so thank you for this, Chris. So Surrey Heartlands, we have a population of 850,000, combined budget of 1.3 billion, and consist of partnership of 10 organisations that sit around our transformation board. If you talk to anybody from Surrey Heartlands for longer than 5 minutes, we will start to tell you about our 3 distinguishing features from the 43 other STP footprints, and they are clinical leadership and our clinical academy, which is how we are tackling unwarranted variation, standardising care across our footprint, spreading best practice and making sure innovation is involved in all of our pathways. And we're heading towards a very grandly named Surrey Expo on March 13th that Chris has very kindly agreed to come and facilitate a keynote speech. So open invitation to anybody if you'd like to come. We are also known for our citizen engagement, and Rich Stockley, who leads on this for us, is conducting an NHSE WebEx on December the 12th. And we've come about citizen engagement in a slightly different way, partly I think due to the close working we have with Surrey County Council, and have recruited a panel of 3,000 citizens that match exactly our demographics. So in Surrey, as you'd imagine, we have a number of articulate people who are very good at getting their points of view heard. And so we have gone out and
deliberately made sure we are in touch with all of our demographics, including the hard-to-reach group, and are using them as a virtual panel to test prioritisation and test questions on our work. So currently there are questions going out from our mental health work stream on the priorities and the work that's going on there. And we're also recruiting, in conjunction with Healthwatch, 20 citizen ambassadors that they wanted to call naked citizens, but thankfully we managed to move from that, and they're now citizen ambassadors, and they will be embedded within all of our work streams. And then possibly the most pertinent difference for today is our close working and leadership from our local authority. And David McNulty, who until recently was the Chief Executive Surrey County Council, has always been the chair of our transformation board. And then in June we signed a devolution agreement with NHSE and NHSI. So Chris asked me to reflect a little bit on the autumn statement from an SDP point of view. So I live in a land of low expectations. I have 2 teenage boys, and I have to say my low expectations may have been met today. Having just checked my phone, my 2 children, I left 3 alarms around the house. They assured me that they didn't need Granny to wake them up. They would be fine to get to school. And having just texted them again, there's no response whatsoever. So I'll have to deal with that at 9:30. So apologies if I'm slightly distracted on that one. So low expectations were met in terms of no social care, no increased taxation around the prevention agenda. So alcohol is an issue in Surrey, and one of our main areas of work is actually, one of our prevention agendas is actually improving use of alcohol and reducing admissions related to alcohol. However, delighted and delighted and pleased really to see the capital funding, and in particular we have Epsom St Helier within, well, with the Epsom site of Epsom St Helier within our patch, and just really to reiterate, this is not about gutters and downpipes. There is significant maintenance that's needed to be done. So Epsom St Helier is one of the top 6 most needy sites, needy acute trusts in the country. And there are areas at St Helier, you've got tarpaulins over the A&E, you've got stroke patients, and from the Epsom site, to get from A&E to the stroke ward, you have to take them with umbrellas to protect the patients. So this is significant maintenance, it's not just a tinkering around the edges. But also very pleased to see the commitment to capital transformation funding, so that we can actually go on and start to look at our new models and different ways of working. So pleased to see the funding for winter, although anxious that it's now December and we haven't got it yet. The distribution of funds seems to again be on the usual quick turnaround, sort of 48 hours to get your plans in. So my fear again is that this will be dominated by acute trust rather than having the funding spread across the entire system. So we've tried to tackle winter slightly differently this year in Surrey Heartlands. We've had weekly senior, so CEO and COO level calls across all 10 providers, and have managed to, for the first time, actually agree at agency caps and locum spends as a collective, as previously a number of organisations have been disadvantaged by unilateral decisions. And we've also managed to prioritise resource going into general practice, into social care and into community services, rather than focusing purely on acute trusts in terms of delivering the 4-hour wait over Christmas. So although the funding's welcome, I think it's clearly acknowledged it's not enough to meet the need that we have, and it's good to see that we've started having a number of the difficult conversations in public. So I'd very much like to applaud and thank NHS clinical commissioners for the work they've done on the low-value medicines. This is work previously that CCGs have done individually, so we've had more than 200 conversations going on, each with slightly different remits, and coming up with slightly different answers. So it's really refreshing to actually have centralised involvement in this and standardisation. So I would say, please, can we now move on and start looking at the procedures of low clinical effectiveness, and also procedures not routinely funded. And can we do this once, not 200 or at best 44 times? So my new job is I'm the Senior Responsible Officer for Surrey Heartlands, and as part of that, I'm accountable really for the delivery of the 5-year forward view. And we all talk about, and we're all very familiar with the 3 gaps. We spend a lot of time talking about the finance efficiency gap and the care and quality gap, and we've got some really excellent work from GIRFT and from Right Care, from Model Hospitals, and Lord Carter's excellent work. One of the things that we've got in the south is actually Anne Eden has been made our South East Regional Director, covering both NHS and NHSI, and this has made an enormous difference, actually more than I even thought was possible. in actually the alignment of regulators and having a single point of contact for us to go to. My plea really around the very excellent efficiency programmes is, and I'm pleased that obviously the programmes are being embedded within the regions, which is helpful. We need one person to go to. We need to have an efficiency programme rather than having our right care delivery partner and our GIRFT person and then somebody else on mod data. And we need to share this data so we've all got it. So the third gap is the one that I think in my current role I'd previously underestimated but now really feel is the most important. It's the health and wellbeing gap. And the only way that actually we can stop the demand and can actually, so I mean, we will be back here next winter saying how are we going to deliver winter, we haven't got enough money. The only way we can change that conversation is actually by starting to address the demand. And if you'll forgive the somewhat heavy-handed analogy, it's starting to turn the tap off rather than continuously mopping the floor. So I have a number of favourite facts at the moment that I'm just going to share with you. So no matter how efficient and inclusive we are as health on our own, we can only ever improve the health outcomes for our patients and our population by 20%. If you enter school at the age of 4 with an inequality, that gap will never close. And the best indicator for entering school with an inequality is your mother's mental health at the age of 14. So we must invest in mental health for our young people. We must invest in prevention. And we must be including partners beyond health and social care to truly make sure if we are involving and using the wider determinants of health. So we must be talking to housing, we must be talking to education. And that's why we're a devolved care system rather than an accountable care system. We must be meeting and talking and sharing priorities with our wider partners. So my last to end is really a plea into the ether. Please allow us to identify the longer term needs of our population and allow us to work out the staffing and funding required to deliver the change. And please allow us to plan for longer than one political cycle to enable us to bring about the generational change that's required.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jim, complete our presentations, please.
Thanks, Chris. When I was doing this, I was trying to change the way I think again from being a chief executive of a national body to a provider again. I don't think it makes that much difference, so I'm just going to ramble a little bit about how I saw the budget and how I see it now as a provider. So I think, first of all, think of the context. So really strange economic circumstances, really challenging economic circumstances for the UK economy. The Brexit thing is a huge issue. Wherever you are, it's just a massive issue. It's a massive unknown and variable that economists and the Treasury would rightly be very concerned about. So on Siva's points about this is only a 2-year deal, etc., etc., no one can plan more than a few months at the minute. So we're never going to get a kind of very long-term deal because that's just not possible anyway. The NHS has been recognised as a big priority and a huge risk financially and economically, and it does worry the national government when they see the sort of numbers we've got moving around and the complexity and risk associated with that. And then there's a huge bit about where is the political prioritisation in all of this. So in the context of Brexit and the money, etc., etc., you can see how it's quite hard to prioritise and make sure we all get what we think we need, which is, by the way, never happened. And a lot of people, I can see a lot of people in the room who've been around a long time. If you think in the really good old days with massive growth, none of us ever felt it was enough. I remember years of 6-7% growth where it was absolutely horrendous. So as an FD, some of my worst years were in those years where we're getting massive growth, but we're actually massively overcommitted. So you get 6% growth with a commitment to do things that actually counted for 10 or 11%. So I'll come back to that. We set off actually trying to secure a handful of things in the autumn statement. So the first one and the big one was get the pay award funded. So, and I, talking to provider colleagues in the run into the autumn statement, that was the big thing. I think that if it hadn't happened, would have meant everybody give up. It was such a huge number, such a big variable, had such a big psychological impact. If the pay award hadn't been funded, we would have just been looking at huge numbers, and I was really clear that most people would have just thrown the towel in at that point. And as Siva said, it's the only part of the public service that's getting the payroll funded. And if you do talk to people in other sectors, they are very angry and upset about what we managed to secure. We all wanted to see some recognition of the deficit and get us back to a time that felt more reasonable in terms of stretch. We wanted to see some money for capital, and that's been at least partly met. And we wanted to see some money to restore basic standards, mainly constitutional standards, which would in turn allow investment in cancer, mental health, primary care, etc., etc. So not absolutely all of those things got delivered, but they were never going to get delivered. It was never possible to get all of those things delivered. And you've got to understand as well, if those of you in a room that are running big organisations, the dangers of giving in to special pleading, and at no time, if you're a chief exec or a chair, have you ever had a budget discussion with any of your business units that says you can have what you want and tell us what you're going to do with it later on? When has that ever happened? It's never happened, has it? If it has, you've probably got a huge deficit. So, I think we just need to be a bit realistic about all that. But the key in all of this is, what do we do with it? What marginal value can we demonstrate with the extra money? It absolutely does not do everything that it's supposed to do. But it also isn't the case that we can't do anything. And what we need now is to get into a place where we can demonstrate that we're going to make as much benefit of the money as is humanly possible, stretch every sinew, demonstrate that we've got results, and be ready for the next negotiation. And on all of that, the big thing we all probably worry about is the psychology of all of this. We've talked ourselves into a very negative place in the last few weeks, all of us, for different reasons and good reasons. But we need to still deliver things. And the NHS is a huge organic entity. All of our people are feeding off the negativity. At some point we're going to have to rally behind a negotiated position where we know what we've got to do and frankly do our best to deliver it. So I think on balance I'm still more half full in that we've got investment that other people haven't got and we had no chance of getting a few months ago. The key now is negotiating what we can actually deliver with it and then actually delivering it. So happy to end there, Chris.
Thanks very much, Jim. So we have about 15-20 minutes or so for questions. Let me kick off with a couple of points. Claire, you emphasised the health and well-being gap and the need to do more on prevention. What's happening to public health budgets in Surrey?
So like everywhere, public health spending has been cut, but actually we've chosen through, so part of our devolution deal, we have been given transformation funding 80 million over 4 years. And from that, we have chosen to prioritise investment in public health and prevention, particularly around, I was talking earlier about the alcohol project. So we've chosen to increase our funding both in social care and prevention and mental health.
And is that money going into NHS services or local government or somewhere else? So
because of our devolution deal, we will have joint decision making around those budgets, and those budgets will come together. So we very much think about it as one pot.
And Jim, if I come to you, so NHS England board meeting last Thursday began a discussion as to what could and couldn't be delivered within the funding that's now being provided. And it looks like there's going to be a particular focus on RTT 18 weeks. What's your view on what's realistic in 18-19, given where we are?
As a provider chief executive, I've argued this in the national role, you can't really make much impact on RTT if you're completely overcrowded from an AD and a flow point of view. So we're actually kidding ourselves to think that we'd do it in that order. So I think the big priority for me would be, let's restore order from a general occupancy and flow point of view. Do all the things we know work, so all of Pat's work and all the stuff on separation of planned and unplanned care, etc., etc., and limber up ready to make a big impact on RTT. But if we say we're going to massively reduce the elective waiting list when frankly every day our operational teams are turning up and cancelling everything because they've just been overwhelmed overnight. It's just not going to happen. So I think in the discussion next, there just needs to be a bit of realism in how those things actually work on the ground.
So have we lost the 18-week target?
No, I think we still need to get back and deliver it. And nobody who's close to patients is happy that waiting times run out. And we often, I think, look at elective lengthening of waiting times as though it's pain-free, it's outcome damage-free, and it's not. There are people who are coming to harm and their lives are being damaged because of waits that are too long.
Example around the new contract for consultants?
Yeah, absolutely, and because it was specifically Agenda for Change that was mentioned by the Chancellor as being fully funded, you're already seeing the consultant contract negotiations that were progressing well, not talks being delayed, but the outcome being delayed into further into the Parliament, which is again a consequence of the funding available.
Yeah. Right. So over to you. Michelle, you had your hand up just now. Please put your hand up if you want to come in.
Thanks. Michelle Drake, Chief Executive London Wide LMCs. I guess we're talking about negotiating, Jim, and I guess the elephant in the room here is the balancing of supply and demand. And what we have, in effect, is a government that appears to be generating supply, generating demand through either digital technology, you only have to look at the ads on the tube and the buses, or through other means to attract a certain group of people, substantial group of people, whose wants are probably less than the needs of those that really we're trying to cater for. And I'd just be interested to hear how we go about having that negotiation with not just the public, but with the politicians who are setting both the money and the frame for this current distortion between supply and demand that I think we're experiencing.
Just to be clear, you're saying politicians are stoking unrealistic demands?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please pass the microphone to the... We'll take 2 or 3 questions.
Joe Farrington Douglas from King's College Hospital. It feels like there's a cycle at the moment, has been for a while, of the NHS making ambitious plans and forecasts nationally and locally, under pressure from the Treasury nationally and from NHSI, and then having to reforecast halfway through the year when we're not meeting those plans, and then sort of scrabbling to recover that position by the end of the year, which feels a bit like how the budget used to work before the OBR, and the Treasury used to set those forecasts. What do the panel think of the idea of an OBR for health and social care? It's been an idea that's been knocked around.
Okay, is there another question before I... Please, Liz, over here.
Liz, please.
The microphone's on the way, Liz.
Thank you. So one of the things that you've all stressed is the need to somehow manage demand in order to do more that we can for those people that need the help. What are your views about self-management and the support and investment in that? Is that something that you would put as a high priority?
Yeah. Siva, why don't you kick off on Joe's point? Do we need an OBR for health?
Yes, I think we've called for an OBR for health. I think it would be helpful. Being slightly cynical, I think the problem is less on the what is needed side. So we could have an OBR set up that would independently say this is the workforce you need, this is the funding for that workforce, these are the priorities for the long term. The question is, do you have someone who's going to listen on the other side? And again, back to that point of we're stuck in this parliamentary cycle. To maximise the opportunities of an OBR for health, you really need this slightly naive view, a cross-party consensus or convention that looks beyond the length of the Parliament, that can listen to those recommendations and act on them.
And Claire, I mean, the point about rising demand, it's a familiar point, isn't it? But you were saying before we started about some of the work in Epsom. You might want to share that as well as respond to what Michelle was saying.
Sure. So Epsom Health and Care is one of our projects going on in the Surrey Heartlands area, which is a partnership between Epsom St Helier Acute Trust, all 20 of our GP practices in the Epsom area, which for those of you who know the patch is remarkable, a community provider, the Mental Health Trust, and when I say community, the other one, community provider or Surrey County Council. And they've been working together as equal partners, working on the over 65s, and have been going now for coming on about 18 months. Actually, Liz has been integral, very much involved in making sure we've got patients involved right from the start in terms of co-designing the care and assessing whether or not we're doing the right thing. And we've just had a 6-month assessment from this year's contract, and they've got a 5% drop in non-elective admissions compared to around the rest of the patches of the Epsom St Helier patch has got a 6% rise in non-elective admissions, and have also got a decrease in the over 65s in terms of A&E attendances. So by working together and by tackling care in a completely different way, so there's an integrated record that is incorporated within EMIS, so all GPs can see it immediately, so you don't have to write a referral letter, so you can raise a task on EMIS that automatically appears. Patients don't know when somebody comes to visit them in the home, whether they're from the acute provider, from the council, whether they're from the community provider. Everyone's got the same lanyard. By actually reducing the duplication with the system, reducing the handovers between organisations, and by having that shared record that's immediately visible to GPs, we've actually managed to produce real change.
So it's an example of an integrated approach
Absolutely.
that's delivering measurable results. What about Liz's other point on the opportunities around self-management and people taking perhaps more control?
So Liz has done some very fine work on self-management and patient activation measures. And so of course we, I mean, if it was all of us, I know that if I was ill, I would very much be taking care of my own healthcare. And would but you have the patient activation measures, if you don't know them, are really good in terms of it's at different times in our life, depending on how ill we are and what is going on, we may want to take more responsibility for the decisions. So if everything is fine in our life, we might be quite happy to have full responsibility for insulin prescribing and for anything else. But should your mother be dying, your child be in hospital and something else, you may then want more support. So the patient activation measures allow you really to express where you are in terms of how comfortable you are with self-management at any time. Yeah. And I think it's having that flexibility, so it's not just that everybody must look after all their health all the time, but to acknowledge that is fluid and that will continue to change through people's lives.
Jim, on the OBR issue, do we need another Quango? Doesn't OBR already look at some of the long-term projections of demand and cost in healthcare?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's on Siva's point. We've got it. There has to be an agreement, probably a legal agreement that you act upon it. So however it's done, and there's lots of really good analysis and commentary on what we need. It's just whether it can actually be translated into pound, shillings and pence. And so I think it'd be pointless creating something else that didn't actually have the status to make sure it was actually going to be followed through. And I think the point was made earlier on, we talk about this as all about money. It's actually the workforce thing that's the big problem. So we could write a cheque today, we couldn't produce the people. That's going to be the big limiting factor, I think, over the next few years, which on your point on demand and the self-care thing, I think the things are connected. The evidence here, self-care really works, so we need to embrace it more. It's also the case we've got, I think it's 3 to 4 times as much money tied up in outpatient attendances today than we have in primary care. That's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. A very high proportion of them are pointless. So where's the digital disruptions and stuff that's going to change that and set us free? And also finally in all of this, I think we expect too much of the national bodies to have the difficult conversations. I think if you can have those local conversations about we can deliver X, Y and Z, we'll prioritise A rather than B. That might mean if you're young and fit you have to wait longer than if you're old and very frail. Let's have them, but don't expect somebody nationally to do it.
Mind you, I mean, Claire made the valid point around low-value treatments. Let's do that once across the country rather than multiple times. Yeah. Can we come back to this workforce issue? Because what Siva said, I think, is really important, echoed by others, that we've got the extra money, but if the staff aren't there, GP numbers are falling, there are 36,000 nursing vacancies across the NHS in England. What are we going to spend the extra money on? Well, deficit reduction is part of it, extra elective activity to deal with the waiting list and waiting time backlog, but it's a pretty fundamental obstacle, isn't it, if the staff aren't there to recruit? Do you have a view on that, Claire?
Well, so my fear with it is that we'll pay ever increasing agency fees to the smaller pool of staff that we've actually got, rather than actually necessarily improving care over the winter. So there aren't enough. So in Surrey, which is traditionally a popular place to work, we've got GP partnership vacancies. It's very difficult to get locums. It's very difficult to get enough social care resource in. It's a real worry.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that is actually the big constraint. So you mentioned, Claire, winter money, and the winter money will probably be released later on this week. We're having lots of conversations with people who are saying they're going to open 2 wards before Christmas. Where, first of all, they're in hospitals that are completely full, and secondly, where are the staff coming from to staff those wards in 3 weeks? It's not going to happen. So we're going to be driven to a prioritisation because we don't have the people in the space to do what we need to do.
So we know there's going to be a workforce plan published by the end of the year, we're told. Secretary of State said that here last week, but probably 10 years too late given the time it takes to train and get more people coming through the pipeline. Okay, let me take a couple more questions and then I'm going to draw our discussion to a close. There's a lady in the middle over there and there's a lady in the front over here. Oh, and there's one at the back. We'll take it through. Very quickly, please.
Hi, Joan Sadler from the NHS Confederation. What's the likelihood that providers, people across the system, are going to hunker down and do what they always did, because we know that self-care works, saying that for 10, 15 years, we don't change our systems. We also know that we need a different kind of workforce, and so actually the conversation has said self-care important, but we've gone back to how do we staff wards. What's the likelihood anything is going to change?
Good question.
I'm Debbie Frost, I'm the chair of Barnet CCG and a GP. And I suppose my concern is that there's such emphasis on the constitutional standards, and yet Claire's definitely said that mental health, primary care should be our priorities. When are the same standards going to be for palliative esteem, for getting things out of hospital? And I just think that we're just on this constant, I suppose, hamster wheel about 4-hour waits, RTT, rather than really moving the workforce out into the community.
Yeah, so it's the old problem, isn't it, about money follows standards and targets, and if you don't have a standard and target, then it's harder to get the money.
Hi, Ben Close from the Health Service Journal. I just wanted to ask, Jim mentioned about patients going to harm as a result of the RCT problems. It's very easy to see A&E departments under pressure, less easy with RTT waiting lists. I wondered if you could go into a bit more detail about the scale of the problem on harm caused to patients by RTT problems.
Yeah, so Siva, let me come to you first. Choose which of those questions you'd like to respond to.
So I'll start with probably Ben's and RTT and harm. It's perhaps not a safety issue, but it's certainly a harm issue in terms of living with pain. And what you see is lengthening waiting lists for even planned operations that you think are quite de minimis. What that then means is people don't just self-care at home, they go to other services like GP, so you see the pressure spread in the system. So I think the point is, just because you're not turning up as an emergency to A&E departments, it doesn't mean that your condition is not deteriorating and your life outcomes, your quality adjusted life years decrease significantly because you're not getting timely treatment. On the other questions, I'm trying really hard to not be depressing and cynical, but under the current way we construct our priorities, I can't see why it would be a rational choice to invest in self-care and public health initiatives when you're going to be judged on how well you got through this winter. If I was a chief exec, that's where my priority would be, and it's only when you think about sort of loop back and doing the right thing that you start investing in the future. But I'm not sure the system would reward you for that at the moment, which is why leadership of SDPs is setting a different set of priorities that seems more in tune with where the system should be going.
And what you were saying, Claire, seems to suggest that things will be different this time around.
So I think that's the joy of devolution in giving us a few freedoms. On your point around targets, we've actually set our own targets that relate much more to patient outcomes and patient experience rather than, so of course we will be judged on constitutional standards, but as a transformation board we are looking at a dashboard that looks at at targets that are meaningful to patients and then patients have helped choose in terms of whether or not we are successful as a system.
Jim, final thoughts?
So I'll pick up a couple of those points. I think on the providers being locked into a certain method now, we all are, and it's just very hard because there's no headroom. But actually the ones that succeed will be the ones that disrupt, change the model, try and invest in out-of-hospital care, etc. And there are some signs that some are doing that, but it's very hard. And it will, I think, be the workforce, the space. There's just a relentless pressure that makes people confront things that they didn't think they could confront before. I think in your point on the parity of esteem, Simon's fighting very hard on all of that. So I think one of the good things of the last few weeks is he has really tried to rebalance this thing, but the constitutional standards exist in law. We can't ignore the law. I would just come back on your point, Ben. I've seen no actual tangible patient level data that shows people have come to harm, but I have seen evidence where you'll see people carrying around illnesses or morbidity, and treatment would have made their lives better. And none of us would want to see that. And if you think the quality definition in the round, experience and access are big factors. So when you've got providers who actually have lost track of how many people are waiting, and there's a few, that's a chaotic system, and there will be harm in there. So we should be looking harder at those things. I think in final closing, a lot of this feels like there aren't choices we can make. None of us live in a tidy system where we're not wasting money on transaction costs, on the pointless commissioning and provision thing, on the lots of layers of duplication and triplication of oversight, etc. And I really can't believe Treasury aren't pushing harder on that. We should be grabbing a hold of that and turning that money into money that looks after patients. And we have to do it in the round with our social care colleagues, housing colleagues, etc. So we all know what works, we just need to do it. And on the capital front, on your points as final sales pitch, before I show your point, Siva, on the off-balance sheet mechanism, Northumbria is going to try and present and offer an NHS version of an off-balance sheet proposition in the new year. So I'd like to come back and talk about that at some point.
There's an offer. So I think on that note, can we thank our speakers for their contribution, and thank you for coming to the fund this morning.
Thank you.